Assalamu alaikum. I know that all of you know the meaning of this. Well, you know, I look to all of you and I say, this is the group that can be called die-hard architecture and heritage lovers, right? You're still in the room after all of this, such a very long day. So I'm really happy to share this session. And therefore, we will have a beautiful, vibrant session for you. And one of the evidences for that is that we will have local voices talking about the local heritage. I go all over the place and people are talking about, foreigners are talking about the heritage of the locals, not necessarily that we would have the opportunity of locals talking about their own heritage. So I think it's wonderful in this session that we will have two speakers, and I will elaborate, talking about the local heritage. And then we will have also two dear colleagues, Professor Nikolaus from Oman, German University of Technology in Oman, and also Professor Salim Ferwati, my colleague from Qatar University. I am in the process of finalizing a book that I am writing in Arabic about what I called the critical narrative of contemporary architecture and urbanism in Qatar, where I described my two dear brothers and colleagues, Ibrahim Jaidah and Mohammed Abel, as the local heroes of architecture in Qatar. And I'm not actually flattering them. My description is related to what I called it a struggle journey that both of them went through. They came back from the States around the mid-80s, late 80s, and both of them, they rejected the temptation of falling in love only of what they have learned from the States, but they had a sort of local commitment and local responsibility to their country, to their context, to their heritage and their culture. They also had a very severe competition because at that time we subscribed to the model of we want to hire foreign consultants. So imagine in the late 80s for two youngcomers to literally struggle to trying to have a sort of a spot on the platform of practicing architecture and urbanism in Qatar. There are also both of them so much excited about the notion of nourishing the new generations and helping the new generation. So every single day, and I'm observing them quite closely, every single day they're trying to help new generations to sort of continue this process of preserving heritage and also coming out with a new language and a new expression related to architecture of Qatar. And also they have a social responsibility in terms of knowledge share and knowledge dissemination. They write, they publish essays, they publish books, and therefore they want to make sure that this, what I call it, knowledge project is a sort of consistent. I am utterly humbled to share this session, and I'm really looking forward to the knowledge and the learning that I will get from both of you and also from Professor Salim and Professor Nikolaus. The order of the session is Brother Ibrahim, then Brother Mohammed, then Professor Nikolaus and Professor Salim, and then I brought 4 chairs here because I know that we will have vibrant Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. My dear Ali, inspiring. I'm not going to mention some of the books that you wrote that could get you in trouble about criticizing some of the architecture around our region, but it will be nice to share it one day. I was asked to talk for 10-15 minutes just to stir up the discussion, and interestingly, I'm going to be talking about the history of Qatari architecture, but as I described, the gentleman who's going to speak after me, I learned a lot of things that I'm going to describe from you from him. So he will maybe shed a few items in depth. When I came back, there wasn't any reference whatsoever, except for some photocopies, booklets, and it's so exciting to see they used to call it the French Expedition Survey. And here I'm delighted, finally, after so many years, to meet the two brains behind it. And that was a beautiful reference for me. And the reason, as I collected all the search and I put my hand into a wonderful survey commissioned by municipality back in the years, which I doubt if they even know where it's archived because nobody have ever used it, but I put my hand on it, translated it into sketches and some analysis. And I said the title 1800 to 1950. 1800 is when Al-Thani sort of united the tribes in this peninsula, and the formation of a nation started its footsteps. And 1950 when the wealth of the oil started coming. So that era finishes in terms of architecture between these years. And the prehistoric Qatar, the fort, I mean, I'm going to show you prototypes of these buildings, but within these, I'm sharing some of the images that are in the book, but within these I'm going to give some of my sort of feelings or criticism on certain eras and periods that happened. Interestingly, Qatar, where we see the Qatar village that's for entertaining and lectures and restaurants and so on. So the name Qatar goes back to 170 years before AD, which is quite ancient. And I read throughout that there was definitely people coming to get some of the shells, to get some colors for the royalties of Iraq back in the years. So there was a lot of dwellings, and they found this, and Rob will shed on Thursday, I think we'll learn a lot more from him, but it was very interesting to see the word Qatar goes way, way back then. And it's interesting, such an old map is almost quite accurate. And what forms this architecture, what forms this culture, this accent, this clothing, the food that we eat? I think our ancestors did a good job traveling, and the pearl diving industry, as it was booming, there was a lot of traveling. And with that, we brought in a lot of cultures. And even the tribes here, when there was wars and starvation, they would migrate to the other side and vice versa, and continue the traveling. Because the whole world was there. Between us and the rest of the Arab world, there was a big desert. Mecca was the only thing that you had to go to, but there wasn't much crossing of the desert. Everything was done by the sea. And I'll shed a light on this. So what forms this culture? This applies to, I think, most of our region, but what forms this culture? In my opinion, well, Oman, it is said, and I read this, that the Omanis were the first people to teach this civilization how to sail against the wind. So their travels, and they showed people who discovered Asia the way to get to there. So there is an ancient history, and as they expanded and brought in a lot of trading for us. Zanzibar, because of the trade, the slave trade, a lot of our music actually is from Zanzibar. These beautiful carved doors and boxes are from Zanzibar. But all of this has penetrated and into our culture and became Basra. Basra was a civilized, even the first missionaries started there. When the Ottomans ruled the region through there, the British had an influence there to rule these smaller towns back then. And of course, Najd, this is where the tribes came from. The rulers came from, and main tribes came from Najd. India, our ancestors used to dive to get the pearls so the Maharaja can put it on his turban. So this was an important trading for us. And we think biryani is Qatari food and sambusa is Qatari food. So it really blended into our culture. And of course, the next shore that shares almost the same size of what we have on this side, which is full of Arab tribes until 40s, 50s, still there is. So all of this has created, I think, our architecture, our accents, foods, musicals, and you name it. And that melting pot really is quite unique. And I'm so glad that we're talking about the Gulf architecture because as I studied back in Texas, there was the Adobe style of architecture. And I think it's about time that this style of architecture is recognized as one of the mankind sort of heritage of style of architecture, as it is so unique only to this Gulf. The growth, 37, it was a bad time. The artificial pearls coming, people were literally bankrupt. There were stories that people started selling their dentures, the wood of their houses, and migrate elsewhere as they didn't have anything to sell. That happened after a thriving, where our fleet of dhows were in the hundreds. That was really thriving, and I'll show you why it was thriving. But again, in 37, the Empire State Building had lifts, and the Brooklyn Bridge had cars. So we've gone really a long way in such a short period. But then with the oil, the growth started coming, and all of us are witnessing. We see all these fancy developments of seafront villas, seafront pearl, or whatever it is, but most of the population had a seafront. You park your boat right in front of your garden, or if you had a garden. That spot in the map is where the best and the most prime pearl diving locations. And it was just right in front of Doha. So Doha and Al-Khor and the city. So even the Kuwaitis, when they wanted to dive, they would come all the way to this location. So that's why our fleet of dhows was thriving, and it was very close. And like I said, when it was a thriving business with hundreds of dhows, and all of a sudden bankrupt, we heard of big merchants got really bankrupt and sold everything they had. So I'll take you through some of the prototypes. The forts, Zibara Fort is quite famous. We know of the Zibara city that was thriving in the 1600s and the 1700s. Schools were there. They even had an interesting water channel that led into closer to the town, but they found a full industry that was happening back there. The Slal is quite unique and interesting. This is where you mix, and probably this happened throughout stages, mix the fort, and we see here a reflection of the Najd style. It's the very typical that goes slightly pointed, but here we see the dwelling happening within the fort, and it's quite unique, and I think this place is really it's being renovated. It has been renovated finally, but it's quite unique into defining what is so Qatari architecture with all the influences that we have spoken, but it became unique in its own self. Marwib, it goes back to the Abbasi era, interestingly. So when the Abbasides were expanding, they had a presence within most of the region. Erkayat, it's the 18th century. Domestic buildings, this is quite unique and interesting, but of course, this is the most important building. Interestingly, when I came back in the 80s, no attention was being done to the local vernacular as it was being demolished, and I'll show you some sad examples. But fortunately, the late Amir Sheikh Khalifa had the vision, and he said, let's renovate this. And he commissioned a team in the 70s to survey and started the rebuilding, and that has won even the Aga Khan Award for restoration. And this became a symbolic sort of reference to what is unique Qatari architecture. And that Majlis in that square one in the middle, I think it's a very unique. I have put my hand into a gift for the opening. It was sold in an auction for the opening of the museum back in the 70s, given by Sheikh Khalifa to the guests, a rare piece of that room. And then different type of dwellings, but we see the courtyard houses. Some of these, even when they were surveyed, had extensions that we see, typical squares. But basically, you get a courtyard, you start with 2 rooms. As the family grows, you add rooms, and that's how the dwellings started coming up. Another thing, these recesses that are in the elevation, as decorative as they may be, but they were a structural element that I learned from Mohammed, that they wanted to make the weight of the walls thinner. So they had to recess them because they have less stones to do so, and so they don't put much weight, but so creative that they made it into a decorative feature. And in some cases it will have openings, and so it will catch the wind into whether it's on the roof or into the rooms. This was, again, in the survey, we see it in the posters down under, but Qatar was really never known to be a wind tower architecture. Historically, there was, at least I know of 2, and they say there was a 3rd one. But this was one of the most, the Nasrallah house was the most dominant, fancy one. And it works. I stood under this wind tower, and the breeze really does work. I think it's a genius invention, but the form of wind towers that was used here was more of the recesses and the parapets of the roof, as the roof was an inhabited area and the wind would slide into the roof area. Different styles of buildings, we see patterns, but this is very typical. You'll see the Liwan as a shaded area, and as I was briefly saying this morning, there are very interesting lessons to be learned, at least for the new creative generation, as they use these elements not as a skin, but as a function, as a genius, coping and adapting to the harsh environment around. How could these people really live and enjoy and get still creative into these things? And they had solutions to do that we need to learn from. We started seeing some of the patterns on the right. This is definite influence from traveling, but the size of your room is the size of your piece of wood that you have to hold your roof. So the rooms were not small due to wanting a smaller spaces, but if your denture is 3 meters, so this is as much as you can span. So different examples, different sort of measurables for privacy, but all these houses grew up stage by stage. This is Al-Uthman house, and now it's within the Musharraf project. And I heard stories of when Al-Uthman moves to where Musharraf is, they told them, oh, you're leaving town, you're going so far away from civilization, they're in the middle of nowhere, and that's Musharraf. It's another Sheikh's house. We see the entrances are quite important, usually, and there is the dacha, where people sit outside, and Majlis is usually adjacent to that, but I remember the days where people would sit outside and greet each other and invite them for coffee and so on. It's a social thing. We see this in a lot of houses also in Al-Wakra and Al-Rayyan. This is near Al-Khalifi. There was an area called Al-Khalifat, Sharq. So where the museum was Sharq, and this is all dominated by Salaiti families. And then further down, there was Al-Hitmi, and then Sharq, where the Sharq Hotel is. Al-Khalifa area. It's a neighborhood dominated by certain families in some locations. But this particular building has good memories because they turned it, as they renovated it earlier on, and when I graduated, it was the Fine Arts Society. This is where the artists used to gather, and in the room, some of our late founders of the art were there. I was a member, and this is where I met Mohammed, as we were both emerging artists. Rayyan, well, this was renovated, so I think a lot of the decorative features were added during renovation because this was sort of quite well decorated, but which I don't think was the case during construction, maybe in the lower areas, but even in the outside parapets, I think this was exaggerated. Al-Mana house also has been documented. This was a thriving Majlis. Al-Mana goes way back into education, and they were the first to teach and to make law. And so this, when there is a ruler of a nation comes, they would stay in these majlises. I took this photo, and interestingly, this documents the guy is documenting signing, the architects. This is when they can sign their names on the buildings. We cannot do it anymore. But it's Abdullah al-Mail, and he's saying, داخل الدار صلي على النبي المختار شغل عبد الله الميل. Abdullah al-Mail is the genius mason who built, he was the architect of, evidently, of the rich. He's the guy who built the museum, which is the first example I showed you, the ruler's house, and he built this Majlis, and it will be nice to one day have an award or some research maybe in the next sessions, in the next years to come, because his family still exists, and if they have any history of what he has accomplished, it will be interesting to sort of acknowledge his efforts into putting our architecture and our identity. AlMajlis House, this is on where the banks are, Hamad Grand Hamad. Al-Fardan building happens to sit on this building. I think after researching, this was the biggest mansion, biggest house I've seen. It was a gorgeous piece of architecture. The elements even of the wind catchers, you see the pieces of wood in the recesses up there, you open them and the wind would definitely slide into the living room. The liwans, the sort of mashrabiyas are there. It definitely is a perfect example. And as I walked out, the truck was there, and the guys moved in to remove the doors and the windows to knock it out. And you know that there is these incidents that happen to you in your life, an accident or something that will change your life totally. That incident really made me open my mind into what is happening to our vernacular, how can we protect it, and why are we knocking them out? And later in the 90s, there was a great comeback, thanks to His Highness Sheikh Hamad, into preserving this history and documenting it. But the building is gone. Mosques, nobody would dare to demolish a mosque. That's why they survived. And it's really sculptural, some of them. And you would see the size of the minaret, the shape of the minaret was based on the mason, what's material is there. But again, like I said, the span is the span of the dentil that you have. And there are some beautiful examples, whether in the Sharq area still existing, fortunately, in Shamal and in different locations, but all of these have been documented. In the book, because of the survey, each one had a name, and this is how it was documented. But just look at these minarets, they're very sculptural. In its own right, it's quite contemporary in its own right in some cases. This style of minaret started appearing not only here, but within the region. This was the first sort of modernizing, but way back in the pre-oil period, but this is when they could afford it, where the mu'adhan would be able to go a little bit higher. But we see this in a lot of towns, even within the Iranian towns or throughout, from Kuwait all the way to most of the villages throughout the Gulf. Al-Qabib Mosque was built in Al-Zabara in the 1700s. And the founder of the nation, Sheikh Jassim, when he saw it, he said, I also want to do something inspired by that. I managed to sort of collect the data and publish it in a book, called it The 99 Domes. And it was rebuilt in Doha. Later in the 17 or 1800s, it was rebuilt, and then it was knocked out. Then the municipality built it in 90s. Then knocked out and was rebuilt by Mohammed as in the stones. And he has stories how they have rebuilt it in real stones. Souk, there wasn't much souks. Most of the souks were an opening in a dwelling or so on in Al-Jasra as you walk in some of the older areas in Souk Waqif. But Souk Al-Bakr Souk was famous back then. It's a little bit more modern, but it was an active. This is where Souk Waqif, literally, the real old Souk Waqif area is. And Rob, you see it's non-decorative. It wasn't like the pointed one, the edges, which was a reinforcement, but eventually became a decorative where the beam meets the column, as we were discussing earlier today. So very organic growth with really answer worth analyzing, and the Harvard research really did. I hope it gets published one day. Dr. Nader has been tracing it, and it's with Hamad bin Khalifa University, so hopefully they will finally publish it, as it started with the Musharraf project, of course inspired by Her Highness to do such a research where a research has been done. I was honored to be part of the team in Harvard and coming back here, but to see the results of it and the analysis that they've done really proves that people lived comfortably there and managed to live. The souks were straightforward, as we have discussed. There have been some reincarnation in the Souk Waqif now of these elements, and it's working. And this is where I say there are lessons to be learned. Now in the West we put big windows and end up putting big curtains that we never open. But somebody really have done an exercise where each single breeze of wind has been calculated and understood. And these are, I think, is the basic analysis that anybody should start by designing a building. And this is where I'm saying, with the influence of the architecture, the aesthetics, making it into a more contemporary to this, I call it going back to basics, these elements I think could be useful. And eventually the sort of international movement came. People were taken out. Well, they were very happy to be taken out because the oil came, and they saw villas in Beirut and in Mumbai and in Cairo, and they wanted to move in these villas with balconies that we could never sit in these balconies. But from these beautiful courtyard houses that could be regenerated, in my opinion, with privacy. You sit in these boxes, nobody goes to the outside. And I remember my older aunts and so on, as they moved from these houses to these houses, became prisoners of the walls inside these boxes. Thank you very much.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm trying to, as an architect, as a painter, as a painter, we were always had a problem of who we are, what is our identity. Yes, so the identity, it is an open question that not anyone had the right or the perfect answer for it. But I do remember that one day I had a problem with one architect who said, do you really have an identity for your art or architecture in this part of the world? Everything in this place is imported. The only thing that you have here, it is a sand, camel, and some oil, which of course it was, it made me, that was in 1980s, and I took my camera and I started collecting data, collecting photos, just to see who we are. So I collected, again, a lot of photos, and I published my book, Ornament of the Gulf, in 1985, just trying to say, no, we have something here. We have a root in this ground. And it is not true that everything that we see or our true art is imported through the surrounding countries. Okay, so in this presentation, I'll be talking about Pearl as a center of our life, and also the 7,500 years that the Pearl's era took before its end in the 1930s. And the Gilgamesh legend and mentioning the pearl in his legend. Then I'm talking about the population, the definition of the geography of the Gulf, definition of the population, and bringing some models of the architecture just to show the common characteristic in the whole Gulf area, that they share the same rules, the same style, they belong to the same, they use the same method of construction. So this is what the human fate in the Gulf was tied to it. You know, I was reading an article that the French expedition team in UAE in Al-Qawain in the March 2014, they were uncovering a site there, and they discovered a pearl. And after testing this pearl, they found that this pearl goes back to 5,500 BC. And they claiming that this is the oldest pearl it was found. So it means something to this area, because Gilgamesh will come after, and he will mention it in his legend too. So the pearl was so important to our life in the Gulf. If someone wants to be rich, he must have a lot of it. And the town could be impoverished if they couldn't go to bring this commodity from the sea. And they could be colonized even because of this richness that as a result of having pearls. You know, we know that the Portuguese were in the area and they controlled the area just because the area was so rich because of this pearl. And even when a man loved a woman, the gateway to her heart was to have this pearl presenting her, or it might be her condition to agree with him. And even the stories that was told to the children in the past, it was about the diver and how he was able to go into a very dangerous places and bringing this wealth out. So it is, in other words, this commodity was the center of the life of the people. Now, if you look at the timeline, I call it the Pearl era. It was, as I mentioned, Pearl of Al-Qawain. It is 5,500 BC. Gilgamesh epic, he mentioned the pearl as he called it, I'll come close to it, the eternal rose. So, and then the Hellenistic, and the end of it was at 1929 when the Japanese pearl hit the area. So, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it says that there was a snake that came out while he was resting and putting the rose of eternity close to him, and he took it and stole that pearl away from him. So as a story, we say that the snake dies, but he just comes out of the dead skin and he is reborn again. So that's because he took that pearl away from Gilgamesh. When Gilgamesh was talking about this incident, he mentioned that he put a stone or a weight to his feet, and he put something to lock his nose to go under the sea and get it. And this practice was known until recently. The diver, they were doing the same tool. They were using the same tools, actually. So the fate of man in the Gulf was tied to the pearl. He was captive to it. He just couldn't free himself. This was the source of the life. This was a source of prosperity. This was a source of his strength in the area for him. But one day, the serpent with red eyes, this is the Japanese flag, showing that it is took the pearl away from the people of the Gulf. And this is, I am just putting it into a metaphoric picture. So when we want to think about the Gulf, what is Gulf? What is the land of Gulf? I think the Gulf, it is like this. It is about 50 kilometer depth into land, going around the sea. If you go beyond the 50 kilometer, you begin to see a different culture, a different style, a different identity. But if you are within this 50 kilometers around the Gulf, you would see a very typical of the Gulf, as I'll show you later on this presentation. And then when we talk about the people of the Gulf, who are the people of the Gulf? People of the Gulf, actually, during the pearl season, people were migrating from the inland, going toward the sea in order to participate in the pearl season, which was from June until September every year. So it was the summertime. So a lot of people were coming into the Gulf to share this wealth that will come out of the sea. Some of them, they stayed in the Gulf. Some of them, they went back. But the main stream of immigration, it was always coming from the peninsula. And sometime, if the political situation was unstable, they will even move to the other side of the Gulf. What was the norm of the life for the people in the Gulf? They had two kinds of life, the summer and winter. During the summer, as I said, it was only during the month of June till month of September, people were all busy with the sea. And after when they were coming to a month of October, everybody moved to the desert. The desert was so generous, and the rainfall was much higher than now. So the people, they just flourished with this grass and beautiful weather that it was in the desert. But they weren't resembling Bedouin. They are totally different. The Bedouin culture that we know about. And then if we talk about the geographical influence on the Gulf, what happened that we have at the north of or the east side of the Gulf, we have Zograt mountains. And these mountains worked as a barrier for the northern culture to come to the Gulf. So it was some sort of separation of culture. While in the western side, there is a very tough sand barrier that separates the Gulf from the Najd, or the highland of the peninsula. So this actually made the whole Gulf to be communicating with each other, while they weren't able to get the influence from the north or from the south. And to my opinion, I think that the Gulf people were so active. They had a very strong sense of identity and art and culture. And they have influenced, for example, the Calicut area and the Zanzibar area. And not as a lot of scholars talk that the influence from there came to our area. And I have the evidence to prove that. So if we come to the architecture, when we study architecture, we try to look at two things, just to see the similarities and to look at the dominant factor in it, to say that, yeah, they belong to the same school. So we have the construction method in the building, and then the decorative in the building, especially the patterns and the gypsum and the wooden element. Here I will take you to a tour in the Gulf to show you how it is similar around the Gulf. So first of all, if we go to this area, it is Qashm Island. There is a town called Laft. I visited this place. It is a town that has freezed in the history. You could see how the Gulf and the eastern side or western side looked like. So, you know, if I look into this picture without showing which part belonged to, it is very hard to say if it is Bahrain, Qatar, or Kuwait. The second town, it is Kong Island, Kong Town. It is only about 5 kilometers away from Linja. Again, this is the house of Nabina. They are very famous in Doha here. They have a Nabina trade. And then Linja. This is Linja, for example. These are all, most of these houses are the houses that belong to Arabs. You know, most of these houses, because the whole area, the Arabs were living in it. But I think during the 1905, when the father of Shah decided to put tax on this area, a lot of people here, they were very important business people and traders. So they just left their town and they came to the Arab side. If we go to Bushehr, for example, again, you know, the similarity, the color of the buildings, the methods of, you know, doesn't show which side of the Gulf you are. If we go to Kuwait, for example, the Kuwaitis, their architecture is influenced mainly by the Bushehr town and by Basra, but it does belong to it. This is Bahrain, and this is Al-Qatif, for example. These are the places which we don't know a lot about it. But again, this building, the way I photographed it, it shows the skeleton, the structure, the wooden beams that holding the building, the grid, the making of the arches in the building. It is a beautiful picture that we can learn a lot from it. Al-Qatif, and then if we go to Al-Hufuf, which is Al-Ihsa, you know, we are now going farther from the Khalij, from the Gulf. Here we begin to see a little bit a different style, different touches. They are closer to Najdian, the highlands of peninsula. So here you begin to see a little bit different touches. And of course, Lusail in Qatar. And the last picture is about Dubai. So these are the mainly a very quick tour just to show the similarities of the architecture and the surrounding the Gulf. And by the way, most of these towns are, built by the sea. Now, if we want to talk a little bit about the unified rules and grammars in the buildings. I noticed that, when they are building, they always begin the building of any walls by keeping this void. It is 30 centimeter columns and 90 centimeter void. It is like this, the structure of the building. And then when he goes, I go to more details about it in a minute, but you see this line, the crossing line. When he rises the building up to 2 meters, then this is the maximum that the wall can hold when it is built from clay and mud. So he needs to put a tie beam at that level in order to be able to go up another 1 meter, for example. So the material here, which dictated the architect to follow the rules and not the rules that was made by the architect. So this line, we always see it, and it is a pure structural element. There is no decorative element that we see in this. This is a pure structural elements and rules that he has to follow. And as we see in Souk, for example, this is arithmetic that we see it balances everything, and he can use it like playing a piano or music, putting all these vocabularies together to show a beautiful buildings. There is no colors. There is no color except the color of wood in the building. But because he playing with this recesses and with this deep void, he's getting, he's catching the shadow and coloring his building with it. So if we go to the construction method, I'll flip this one quickly. So he starts with the foundation, and then he has to build a colonnade wall. It is like this. It is the space between the columns is about 90, and the columns itself it is 30, except the corner one, which is 50 by 50. Then after that, he needs to put a tie beam, which is dentil. And then after putting this dentil, he is able to go another 1.5 meter, probably higher. And then he needs another tie beam, which is a top tie beam. So can you see this grid is starting to appear, the vertical and horizontal line starting to appear. Now, he will have to close the upper part with the panels. We call it wall panels. And then he can add the roofs. After adding the roof, the upper lintel, he needs to put support arch for it, because the lifespan of the wood within these lintels, it is about 30 to 50 years. Most of the building that I restored, I opened this lintel and you see that the dentil has disappeared, has been eaten by the termite. So he knew that this is a problem that might make his building collapse. So that's why he is putting these arches. So just in case if the dentil disappeared, these arches will carry on the roof for him. And then, of course, the parapet. And then he will add the wooden parts, windows. And when it comes, looking at the building like this, it is supposed to be readable by the architect. You know, he knows where he needs lintels, he needs, and when he rendered the building, it just give it this beautiful decorated facade that he will get. The columns, he is using 3 types of columns: the square one, and the arches again 3 types, the rounded one, half rounded like this one, and then we have the cylindrical columns with pointed arch. And the last one is the cornered support arches. It is actually because he is using at that point dentils, wood. So it is very dangerous to not let that kind of support to be there. Otherwise, if the dentil disappear in 30 to 50 years, that means the whole ceiling might collapse. And thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much. I would like to introduce myself briefly. My name is Nikolaus Knebel. I'm a professor of architecture and urban design at the German University in Muscat, Oman. And I have the feeling that given the context here, my presentation is maybe a bit of a risky thing because I'm not a historian by background, even though I'm very interested in the history of architecture, and I'm not from the region. I'm a German architect. However, I've been here for 8.5 years in Oman now, and I'm always happy to find an exchange with the neighboring universities and academics. So my background is that of an architect, a researcher, an educator, and I'm interested, when I reflect about what I teach to my students, is the question of what matters. What really matters that I prepare for them as knowledge. And I think about that often because in my career over the last years, I have taught in many what's called emerging markets. I've worked in building up an architecture faculty in Ethiopia, a very quickly developing country. Now I'm in Oman, rapid urbanization happening. I'm married to an Indian. I go to India every year. I see the rapid change in the urban design. I studied in Singapore, an equally rapidly expanding and developing city. And what always strikes me about these places is that these are cities that are younger than the inhabitants. Even my students in Oman are older than a lot of their city. That might sound a bit banal, but the longer you think about it, the more it puts the notion of time that we discuss here in a symposium about tradition and heritage into an interesting perspective. And therefore, I'm very happy that there is a discussion about the question of where is the upper end on the time scale for defining what is traditional architecture of the Gulf. So my contribution here is to reflect about the 2 terms of efficiency and identity. I think these are the two main streams of discourse here at the moment in the region, if not even beyond. But the problem is that these two discourses about identity and efficiency are disconnected. They do not meet. There are plenty of buildings that are very image-driven, that are almost purely about identity. And equally so, there are lots of buildings that are technologically driven, that get certifications for their energy efficiency. However, typologically, they are not very interesting. So my question is, how do these discourses come together? I think the problem is not new. If you read about architects practicing in the 1950s, 60s, you find a discussion of the same kind. For example, one of the members of SOM, Nathaniel Owings, said when he designed the Hilton Hotel in Istanbul in the late 50s, I think, he said it felt to him like doing Turkish architecture and American plumbing and heating. So here again you have identity, efficiency as two separate discussions. So when we look at how we bring these discourses together, I think we need to look at what's called passive design strategies. In the discussion about eco-houses, we separate between what's called active and passive design strategies. So the active strategies are the technological ones, the ones where you need to press a button to get a machine going in order to cool a building. And the more you optimize it, the better. The other discussion is about the so-called passive elements. So all the decisions that have to do with orientation, with construction, and so on. Now, the passive means are, for me, the core architectural themes, because they relate directly to the form that we give to buildings. And I asked myself, what is a good method to carve out knowledge to learn from the passive elements that were used in the historic, in the modern, and the contemporary architecture? And I think, and I'll then go through examples, a good method is to work with patterns. Some amongst the architects of you might remember that there was this big discussion about patterns and pattern language in the 1970s, 80s, a format that was introduced by an architect called Christopher Alexander. And the idea of patterns is to formulate knowledge and disseminate knowledge about what is called proven solutions for recurring problems. So not the specific once only applied solution, but solutions that appear over and over and that seem to be successful for architecture. So I have tried to prepare for you a little panorama about solutions that I think meet both questions, efficiency and identity, and that could be maybe inspiring for a discussion about the architecture of this region. Patterns usually have a bit of a colloquial kind of a title. So that first pattern that I would like to discuss is that we need to look for cover, of course, because in this latitude around the Tropic of Cancer, we have high impact from solar radiation from the top. So it's all about the roof, the cover that we give to spaces. And a fantastic example to learn from is the 1960s design by Michel Ecochard for the National Museum in Kuwait, where we see that the central yard around which the museum is located is covered by a huge space frame and a truss, and there are plants growing under this. This is probably a very comfortable shaded public outdoor space that is naturally ventilated. A similar pattern, even though it looks a bit different, I see in the modernist 1980s, slightly archaic, rough, but somehow impressive shades, again, that shade public space. Here it is the main bus station in Abu Dhabi. Kind of dramatic forms colored in a bright turquoise. However, a very comfortable outdoor space that is created. And if we go on, we see this motif now in a much more sophisticated design in the umbrella project by the German engineer Bodo Rasch in Saudi, where you see how a public space can be enhanced by giving it a filtered light, a good natural ventilation, and shading. Similarly, exactly the same motive we find here in a design for Master City, not built, but strikingly similar. So we can draw a line from these 1960s designs all the way until today. And you might be familiar with this design for a public park, even unbuilt, however seriously trying to build it in Abu Dhabi, the Al Faya Park. That is almost an underground park. So looking for cover, finding a roofing for public space, I think is a pattern that works in this region, in this latitude, in this climate, and that is maybe not found in traditional architecture that clearly. However, it would be a unique element if employed more often in this region and could give an identity. Now, if we look further into public space and now a combination of how public space and buildings interact, we see that the buildings are coming under the roof. Here we have, this is not Paul Rudolph, sorry, this is CERT, the US Embassy in Baghdad. This is a wrong title, sorry. But you see the idea of the building going under the roof. And one of my favorite buildings in Dubai, the Dubai municipality from the 1980s, where you see the representative buildings where the city council and so meets, going under this roofed area, and the public space that is cooled with a water body and with a semi-transparent roof. So a typology of architecture that is modern, that is efficient, but that really works in this area, and therefore I think could be part of a discussion about identity. The Bahrain National Museum again uses this interplay of roof and volume, and of course the fantastic new building of the Louvre. Don't know if you've been there. Last month I had the pleasure to be there. Shows the power of creating a shaded outdoor space through having a kind of a umbrella over a cluster of small spaces. If we go even a step further, we take the roof away and we look at what the building could do in order to be identity giving and efficiency creating. We could start our search with this project by Walter Gropius and his team of TAC when they came forward with designs for the university campus in Baghdad. And here we see the whole building, a mosque, kind of hovering over the ground and pulling the public space under the building, and therefore again providing a great shade and at the same time a monument. if we not only look at the Gulf region, but if we go around the Tropic of Cancer, and here we're on 27 degrees north in Jaipur, again, a very hot, dry climate, we see a building lifted off the ground, cooled by water bodies, with, at other places in the building, greenery in that space. We see how a different typology emerges, and I think that is part of the panel here, that we look at which typologies give an identity to this area and drawing this identity from negotiating climatic aspects besides cultural aspects. If you look at the Siemens headquarters in Masdar, you see exactly the same pattern of a building hovering over the ground, giving daylight, but limited, just sufficient daylight to the public space under the building. So in many places, these spaces don't work, but in this climate, they do. And therefore, I think they're worth considering and exploring and developing. Here is a pavilion for the Dubai Expo by Danish architects, big, where you see again, the building is over the public space. So the public space is not in front of the building, but under the building. And then the building is more like forming a cave over this space. And there's controlled light, water, plants that make the place comfortable. Another pattern we could carve out from the panorama of these projects would be summarized under the slogan, to take the outside inside. For example, here, a school in the UAE where the classrooms are clustered around a central courtyard. In the middle, you can see that roof over the central courtyard sticking out. As far as I could research, I might be wrong, but that's my guess, this courtyard is an outdoor space. However, it's almost built like an inside space. So we have this blurred border between what is actually inside and outside. And this is, for me, a point of starting to think about what the identity of architecture could be beyond, say, the traditional typologies that we must study as well, of course. In the fantastic structuralist building of Qatar University, we find similar spaces where actual outdoor is indoor, where it feels like an interior, but it's actually an exterior. And these spaces only work in this climate. In Saudi, you can find exactly the same pattern in Zaha Hadid's Energy Research Center, where you see a huge covered public space between the research labs that are on the right and the left. So this is an architecture that takes the outside inside, and you can't do this everywhere around the globe. So there is a local uniqueness that can be exploited here. Rapid in is a pattern that is obvious. You need two lines of defense. As Louis Kahn said that, you have the sun and the rain border, horizontally or vertically. Here is a building from the 1990s, even though it looks even a bit older, from the UAE, or temporary or flexible sunshade on the Al-Bar Towers in Abu Dhabi, where you see the space between the sunshade and the building evolving into an interesting element. You can find similar discussions in some of the towers in Dubai, where shading and structure are being merged. Another pattern that I would like to put out for discussion would start with the appearance of the traditional architecture of the region. We've seen the Bahla Fort in other presentations today, which I think these kind of buildings are stunning in their sculptural quality, in their presentation of huge closed plains, and then only very unique and carefully placed openings. And if we follow down that path, we could see that a modern bank building from the 80s, SOM's National Commercial Bank in Jaidah, is not so different. It's radical in its closedness, and then equally radical in its openness of having these sky gardens cut out, but somehow an architectural language that is efficient and identity-giving because it refers to the climate of this place. The national, I think it's the Islamic Development Bank in Jeddah is actually the title, is a very sculptural building that you could not build in New York or in Berlin or in Frankfurt. This kind of chiseled block only works here and is a chance, I think, for the architectural language here. On a similar latitude, if we just go on a search around the globe and we look at between the, say, 23rd and 33rd degree latitude, this time on the southern hemisphere in Chile, you find, again, the sculptural quality of architecture that can be developed because the light situation, equally to here, has certain conditions that structure buildings differently than if they were further north or south. And of course, a building next door here, we've just visited it, the Qatar Foundation headquarters, again, is a highly sculptural building that is specific in its design to keeping the light out, letting the air through, and if we go further, that brings ventilation into the building. So that's the next pattern. I would call it inhale, exhale, so that there's a breeze going through the building. Of course, the wind towers are the starting point. We see wind towers in the kind of employed, literally. In the Qatar university buildings, we see that, again, the same bank building, there is actually a void in the center of this tower so that the wind can go through. The whole building is a wind tower, even though it looks a bit different. And I don't know if you know this project from Kuwait, very recent residential tower that actually it's called wind tower, but it has a wind tower in its core. So typologically, the tower becomes different because the core is no longer there for circulation, but it's moved to the sides. And you have a different kind of neighborhood now and a different kind of possibility to ventilate the apartments. And that comes from thinking about what works efficiently in this region and thus gives an identity. And my last picture is from the inside of the Qatar Foundation headquarters, which I think is one of the most inspiring buildings in the region because it brings together efficiency and identity. The inside-outside spaces that are behind this facade are, I think, a sign into where one could go with the architecture of the future by connecting to, in a way, the modern tradition, or even before that, to the, say, vernacular tradition, taking patterns from there and working out forms that belong to this place. So for me to end this little presentation for you here, identity, efficiency, or you could say appearance and performance were like opposite ends for the last 100 years. If you look back almost 100 years from now, actually 99 years ago, the Bauhaus was founded. So the beginning of the modern movement, which led to an international style where functionalism was applied as a universalism, now after 100 years comes to a point where functionalism, making a building efficient, is actually a regionalism. And I find that an interesting closing of the circle of modern architecture after 100 years that I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum. Well, I am the last speaker today. I know you are tired, and I am tired. However, those lectures or presentation we just looked at, it was really refreshing and make us really love to hear more. And I hope my lecture is going to be contribute to the same attitude you just had from the previous presentations. Yeah, the previous speaker, Nikolaus, actually, he introduced himself. It's good to introduce yourself when people don't know who you are. But anyway, I'm just an architect. I had a degree in urban design, another degree in environmental psychology and cultural geography. That's what I am. I had a lot of work with heritage when I was back in Syria. I'm from Damascus, Syria. We did a lot of documentation of heritage buildings, almost 80 of them. I built a model for all Damascus with the challenge with Ecochar. When I just mentioned about Ecochar, the French architect, before he died, actually, he visited us, and we had a trip to Damascus, and he said, there is no way you can make a model out of that 1 to 500. And I did it. And now it is in the museum, in one of the museums in Damascus. Anyway, saying that, I went to Saudi Arabia. I introduced myself there to different culture, even though Arabs are the same in terms of Arabs, our language, and etc. But they were really, in terms of culture, too much different, you can see. We went from there to Canada, a few years, came back to to Oman. I stayed there in Sultan Qaboos University for a few years, 6 years almost, and I had one of my colleagues now here. He used to be my student, Haitham Al-Abri. I am glad to have him here. He's a doctor now, and he's doing a lot of work related to renovation. Now I am mostly working with something related to design issues and social studies in my research. I select the topic for this lecture, static and dynamic. When it comes to the traditional architecture, what is static, what is dynamic? The word are not, I didn't find it in social literature or in something related to architecture and urban design, but I found it actually in physics and so on. So I have to define it. Static is something when you copy as it is. You don't change it. The way I found it, the only way you can say static. I have an arc, it has a name, it has a proportion, it has been used by certain culture. You bring it as it is, copy it, and put it there. I can refer to Abdul Wahid al-Wakil. His work mostly came with that ideas. Static, his work mostly static. When it comes to dynamic, is you take those elements or styles and you play with it to create a new architecture. However, still has this architecture, still remind you of the original of that style. So I went into this notion to define, to say something actually about Qatari architecture. Let me talk about this story. It's a very small one, just to tell us how successful is really Qatar in preserving its own identity. One time I went to Vietnam to attend a conference there. It was my first visit, and sitting beside the driver, trying to look at the environment. They were driving almost 45 minutes. I have not seen any elements tell me I am in Vietnam, except people who are walking on the streets. I saw French style. I saw buildings like modern, we call it modern, but nothing say really Vietnamese architecture or identity. Until I reached my hotels. In my hotel, I found this piece of art sit beside my bed. The only piece I saw it. And I asked about it. They say, well, this is really contemporary art, however, it represents also Vietnamese architecture or art in one way. So it has been divided into two parts, mostly with more ornamentation to go back to their heritage, and the other one was with modern. So it's combined in one pieces. I love it, but I came here to the same story about Qatar. I say, okay, when I left the airport, going to the university, what can I see? Everyone can see those light fixtures, very big, huge columns with Islamic art around it, Islamic pattern. You say, okay, is it belong to Qatar or to another wider identity? People mostly refer to it as Islamic, most of the cases. We go there to the Orient Hotel, Sharq. Also, you can see there some heritage. And as you move in, you can go to Souk Waqif, you can see it. You can see Mushayrib now, and you can see Museum of Islamic Art, and so on. Until you reach the Qatar University, you can see also this old campus, also remind you about something about the region itself. So I say now, well, Qatar is doing fine. Doing is knowing how to preserve its own identity, and also the most important things, it has very good introduction. Once you are getting out of the airport, you are introduced to the culture. I haven't seen that in Vietnam. I will ask any country have this kind of really notion. They're trying to recreate nice introduction to their own identity from the time the tourists, when they leave their airport, they can see this identity or not. This is my questions. I think Qatar is doing fine with that in that regard, and the thanks go actually to Ibrahim, Jaidah, and Mohammed Ali, who they are here, who are having them, and they have their excellent presentation just now. I just make this one very quick just to see from 1950s, here it says 30s, 50s and so on, when we have the tradition was almost dominating the architecture identity. So if I was before that, the red line, this refers to the tradition, could be stable, straight. But from that time, I start from the 50s, start to go down very sharp. That means architectural identity of Qatar got thread. People will not apply it for some reason. And the modern architecture, which is the green one, start really soar up in its domination in this region, or in this area. Other architecture might be the Islamic architecture. It's not really strongly presented when it comes to analyzing the buildings in Doha, but it is there, even though now it's going a little bit high, but with a slow implication. So now the question is, the shift and move of Qatar identity happened. And at the same time, we still have the presence of the tradition of Qatar. So I have to ask a number of questions, create my own objective and method, etc., to achieve the goal of this research. First of all, what is the Qatari architecture? Actually, Dr. Ustaz Mohammed Jaidah, actually, Ibrahim Jaidah already defined what is Qatari architecture. And the second one, what is the contemporary architecture in Qatar? Another question. And another question, number 3, to what extent the identity is affected by outside? And this one, actually, I have to go to some theory came from geography, which I had, one of my degree came from geography. To Higar Strand, he's a Swedish geographer who created the idea of the diffusion of theory. And he has very interesting idea of how things move, how the language move between boundary, how the disease move between boundaries, how culture move between countries, language, religion, etc. And according to his theme, I'm gonna divide my presentation. At the end, we can have some really understanding of resistance or to change in Qatari identity. So the idea of the work happened like this one. First of all, we select areas which has different type of Qatari architecture, barrels, which mostly has some Islamic and global. Souk Waqif is 100% Qatari. Mushayrib is a Qatari but with modern notion. And we have West Bay, also it has a mix of different styles. From there, we go there to do some field observation. From field observation, Forgot, I don't see. From field observation, we have to go to the people. Why you have to go to people? Because at the end, we are building for people. Our concern is the user, number one. When Kevin Lynch created the image of the city and he went to create, kind of really find out how the people see cities, those who came from science, they say, so what? So what? So we know the image of the city, so what, how is that going to be beneficiary? How is it going to be applicable for us? The response was very simple, very simple. When we know what the people see, we can know the strong and the weakness in the city, part of the city. So we can put more emphasis on the strong part and put another work or effort to improve the weak part of the city itself. So when you go to the people, you have to know how the people see things. So then when you put an effort, you know you are putting the effort, the money, the expertise, the time, all of that in the right place. Because at the end, the people who's going to be use it, going to be experiencing what you are building for them. I'm not going to build really beautiful architecture at the end, see people escaping out of it. There is an example in Yale University, I believe, when an architect, I think Philip Johnson, built a beautiful building department, and the architectural journal write about it, how beautiful, how nice, but they found the students don't use it. Why? They say when the summer, it became like an oven from inside, so everyone go outside. So the beauty of the building didn't help to create successful architecture. It's successful in terms of buildings, successful in terms of aesthetical issues, but it's not successful in terms of user at all, so they left. So this kind of things we have to pay attention. So that's why we have to go to the people to see how they really think about what they are looking at and what they conceive. So from there, we went to the people to ask some questions. We're using some photographs. And at the end, the participant asked to also relate to fusion theory regarding their knowledge, interest, resistance, decision, implementation, and adaptation of emerging ideas. So this actually the method was for this presentation. This is the fusion theory. Sorry, this is the fusion theory. This is the one, came from Higger Strand. So we have information and interacts matrix. Those goes to the mean information. Mean information fields mean here Doha, for example. And you have information flowing from outside, coming by expatriates, or by media or anyway, or any means. Interaction matrix, when they meet together, how things really interact. Either there is a barrier. Barrier, that means there is a mountain. And one of the, like Muhammad Ali, before Mr. Muhammad Ali, he said there is a mountain when it's created, or there is a boundary to show that this is a Gulf culture are different from the inland culture because there is some barrier between them. It's one of the barriers we may consider it. Another barrier could be the language or the culture or the media, for example. When you are not allowed to interact with other people. That's happened when we have Syria dispute with Iraqi during Saddam Hussein and Hafez al-Assad. They say people cannot interact to create really political barrier between two people, two societies who are one, but they cannot talk, they cannot interact in any way for almost 30 years. So imagine that can't be happening. So now if both of this information are reached the mean of information field, so in this way, and they survive from the resistance and the barrier, so we'll have to have the field when things happen. Is Doha, for example, we either take as it is, the international style, or you may work with it to make it fit your own taste of the beauty. Example, the pizza in America and pizza in Italy. The pizza, you eat a pizza every day. You say it's American pizza or Italian pizza. When the American take it, adapt it to change it to be American. It's totally different. So when I ask one of my Italian friends, he say totally different from Italian pizza, for example. Here is the same thing. So you can adapt something, but you may put your own flavor to it, which is here your own identity. It became mixed between the source, where it came from, and your own local identity. That's what we call it sometimes postmodern architecture or new vernacular architecture. And this is what happened. So this is a theory, and this is the theme. I'm going to work on it, dividing the research according to that one. Here, by looking at the history, I'm not going to talk about the history anymore. We heard from the source, the pure source about the history of this place. However, I'll refer to one thing. Look at these two pictures, for example. Doha before and Doha now, and you can see the difference between both of them. I refer to Norberg Scholz, if you know this writer, he's a German, about his Genius Loci book, he wrote it, when he say there is potentiality or beauty of something, but we don't see until we implement it. For example, he said if there is two mountains, if you put a bridge between them, you can see there is connectivity between these two mountains when you apply bridge to it. And here I can refer to the same idea of his thought, saying that all this beauty of now, what we see of the shore line of Doha, Corniche line of Doha, was hidden until we discover it as a designer. You are living in a place, they have, before 50s, they were poor people. When they discovered the oil, everything changed, right? So the land is rich until we brought this richness to the surface and became really, looks unique as it is. So Doha, the same thing, has a lot of rich in its identity, in its heritage, in its people, but we need to bring those together, somehow discover them to create uniqueness to the place as we can. So this is the way I look at it from these pictures. Another one here, just remind everyone about how the Islamic architecture usually as a city, Islamic city, how it looks like. There is always center of mosque and commercial and leading main road to the center, and the buildings are surrounding this place. That's what usually happened and also in Doha, but Doha from before and now, we can see there is more than one center. This is a global trend, more than center. So we refer to another theory which says city within cities. City within cities. So Doha is not one city. Some people may sit in part of the Doha for their entire life, never seen the another part of Doha, because another part of Doha, it has its own center, its own neighborhood, its own activities, and if you don't have any business with it, you don't go to it. So Doha has become really growing up with more than one center as it is. Very humble 3 image of different type of buildings. I bought this one because I'm going to analyze those very quickly by looking at that one. So the summary of looking at quickly about this architecture, to look at the main element of architecture and divide them between static and dynamic. As I say, static is something, if you change it, people will not recognize it. So it has to stay as it is. Arc is one of them. Arc, we have a number of types, 12 type of arcs in the world. There is a Mamluki, Seljuki, Osmani, Romanian, Gothic. There is so many of them. Once you play with them, all of them, we cannot say pointed arc just like this. There is many arc are pointed. So which one pointed arc are referring to? Is it the one Ayyubi pointed arc, or the Seljuki? What they refer to it now as Iranian, which is not Iranian, it's Seljuki arc, pointed arc. They are totally different. So this arc, it has to be static. If you want to apply it, you have to refer to it, or give it its name. Once you change the proportion, the whole arc type changes. However, other things are possible to change. The ribbed elevation, I think it's static, even though Musharraf, they have used it. And we can go with a number of things. I propose it here as it is. So the character of space and form that are typical to traditional Doha are the existence of clustered low-high buildings. Number of the one things we can see from the building, traditional building. Building frontage touch each other and all flow a connected building line. What I'm doing here, just summarizing the study has been done by analyzing this old city. You can read it if you want, but we can see buildings are connected, low rise, it has some features to adapt it to the climate and to meet the social requirement of the society. From that one, we start looking at different regions. We select four areas, as I say, with different architecture and urban design pattern. The first one is Pearl, Qatar. Is an example of mixed district architecture. Qatar is not really every building has different style. No, it has district has different style. That's what it is. And this studies, what we have done, it looks like people, when we refer to Beryl, if they are not living there, they think always they Port Arabia. And their response came from that reason, when we make survey, came always analyzing Beryl as Port Arabia, not as a Beryl as a whole. So it is a mix of district with different architectural style. Second one is Souk Waqif, it's a purely 100% static Qatari architecture. Third one, sorry, since talking about Souk Waqif, just a quick, an old interview happened with Mr. Ibrahim Jaidah. He referred that Souk Waqif is a good example. So the government has really to, it's good things that the government preserve Souk Waqif, and also he wants that the government also to encourage a movement toward preserving historical site. That's beautiful things came from the local people who experience and see the success of such work. Now, the third example came from Musharraf. Musharraf is an example of the dynamic aspect of traditional Qatari architecture. So we have to look at it as a dynamic, not a copy. We are not copying here. We are changing, but at the same time, we can see the beauty of the identity of the district itself. Some example about how part of it has came from tradition, being adapted in Musharraf design. OSP mostly international style. However, the most important thing is Barzan Tower has been set in a corner that when people go to the OSP, always come across it somehow. So if you ask them about it, does it have any Islamic or Qatari architecture, you say yes. However, if they have taken different roads, they may say no, because most of OSP looks like international style, more or less. Now we ask the people, we have almost 90 people we interview, and we ask them just to put a ranking, which one of the building they think is more representing Qatari architecture, or we can see that Souk Waqif was number 1, Musharraf was number 2, Beryl number 3, and Westby was the last selection for them. The idea of this, the idea of arranging card, I use it in my PhD a long time. I found it very easy for people. People usually don't like to answer verbally, and difficult to start reading a lot of questions. Make the interview as a game. Put on a card, say, can you put them in order the way you like? And when they do that, we record it. This is what happened. And this is we can see Souk Waqif still on the top of the list of people selection. Another survey was looking at different buildings and asked people the same thing. How much is it really Qatari or Islamic or international or a mixed style? Those pictures they are. And you can see Barzan Tower, Sharq Village, and Mohammed bin Abdul Wahab Mosque has the top presentation, percentage. The mosque of Mohammed bin Abdul Wahab was almost 89, almost 90%. People say it is really represent the local architecture. While the Sharq, they look at it as 72, and Barzan Tower as 63. Sounds acceptable, those number came from the people. Another two different buildings, and Musharraf and modern art, the Museum of Modern Art. We can see that Musharraf has 60% as a Qatari, 30% as modern. However, in the Museum of Modern Art, 77%, we can see the elevation of it mostly Qatari looks like, and 10% only as modern architecture. Another more photos. I see there are 10 photos, and how this people really select their they are Qatari or not Qatari. You say West Bay, almost 87. They say definite non-Qatari as a modern non-Qatari. Now we look at elements. So first of all, yeah, I'm almost done. First of all, I was looking at district. Second, I was looking at building style. Now I'm looking at elements. We set a number of elements. I will look at only 6 elements now to see how the people see this one are Qatari, non-Qatari. The first one was ranked, the first one was Barajil, ranked as 89, 82 as a Qatari element. Second one as 85 as an Islamic, the pattern. The third one looks like they called it as Islamic again. The third one here, this Mashrabiya, 98 as Islamic, almost 100. When you look at the wooden traditional ceiling, you see that from down there, they say it's 96 as Qatari, which is interesting. And the last one is the tower in West Bay. They look at it as 71 as Islamic. But they don't say it's really as Qatari in any way. There are so many actually questions, so I will look at only look at the title and go through one example for the time being. Here we're trying to look at the main information fields. We ask people right away a statement saying that the identity of Qatar survived from the encouragement of the contemporary architecture. 35 they say agree, only 35 agree. That means they still people think it might not. Contemporary architecture in Qatar is a mix of style and doesn't present Qatar. 74 they say agree, and so on. So there is a number of questions like this. Another questionnaire was asking people about the information interaction, talking about the influence of the modern architecture. They found the commercial has high influence in terms of architecture. When you go down resident list, an institution has 20%, government and educational. However, religious and industrial, 0 influence of modern architecture. So many interesting questionnaire has been set, and as you see it, barrier resistance. Yeah, okay. I can, here we are talking about barrier. We can see the reason why some of the international or modern architecture didn't go through, they say building regulation. Without building regulation, you may find more modern architecture really imposed on Qatar. So building regulation put something. That's the way people see it. Religion, lifestyle, and the climate has created a barrier to use or to copy modern architecture in Doha. Okay, since I've been getting some thread that I have to finish, wrap up. A preference, which style they prefer. Most of people, 42, they say prefer traditional. That's interesting. And combine, we have less. There is a number of questions here. People ask statement, they look at it. I look at the first one, say, today Qatari architecture has a strong connection with history. 70% agree, strongly disagree. Wow, and so on. So I'm sorry, I cannot go through all of these. There is 3 of these pages, 10 questions, 10 statements. And this is a summary of those 10 statements. Recommendation from that one. So when we look at this one, we have to do some recommendation. However, if you want to go through it, you are welcome. I read only 2 of them. The yellow one, the urban and architectural identity should provide a sense of continuity with heritage context. So the idea is not to say, yes, bring everything as it is, it's beautiful, it's going to be accepted for Qatar. No, it has to have some really continuity from the heritage of the place. In response to the climate circumstances, the use of open courtyard, etc., should be considered as a statically or dynamically adaptable element. So that means, remember those elements of Qatari architecture can be used in one way or another, either as static or as a dynamic. You adapt them in your design, and you can see you are preserving the identity of the place. Okay, this is my final few statement. The urban pattern and architecture characteristic identify an iconographic of the place, etc. And you are welcome to ask any question at the end of my presentation. Thank you.
I think you would agree with me that we had a very, very interesting session. And I want to open the floor for discussions, but I just need to provoke you and stimulate you a bit by sort of shedding light quickly on what I've kind of learned personally from the four narratives. And I would start with what Ibrahim said regarding what I would call it the very first wave of globalization within Qatar, when he showed us that what we label as traditional Qatari architecture culture is also a sort of influence coming from different geographies around the country. And he stressed also the idea of how to learn from principles and concepts as opposed to learn from the skin or only the visual vocabulary of the heritage. And what was interesting that Brother Mohammed continued or substantiated the same argument, suggested also that it's a fundamental question, is an existential question to ask about our identity. And he narrated this beautiful story about a friend or a colleague telling him, what do you guys have in the Gulf? It's only a desert or a couple of camels. And how he narrated with us a very long historical story that suggested that we have a very concrete identity and sense of being. And also he stressed the notion of the language of architecture as opposed to the style of architecture, which was also interesting, the word language, because Nikolaus also presented his paper based on the notion of the pattern language. I was a student of Christopher Alexander in UC Berkeley. He authored a wonderful book called A Pattern Language, and he used the word language to suggest that within any language you can be very creative. So language is not a straitjacket. On the contrary, you can, as long as you know that it's a set of principles and concepts and meanings and ideas. And therefore Nikolaus creatively started to come up with his own pattern language regarding our regional and local architecture, and was suggested in beautifully narrated 8 patterns. Each of them would start with a beautiful slogan, and then how the slogan is represented in a way that again can open a lot of horizon for creativity and innovation. And then finally we had Professor Salim suggesting that architecture and heritage has static aspects and dynamic aspects, and he had his own interpretations for that, which I think would definitely open the floor for a lot of debates and questions. So I'm expecting a lot of questions. Who would be the very first hero? Here you go.
Thank you very much to all of the participants for the enlight giving in this session. I have a question about the architectural typologies of traditional architecture. So some sources are actually classifying this as the architecture of the Gulf as the Arabic masonry and Persian masonry. Have you encountered in your research or in your studies such classification? Is this classification working with covering all the typologies that we have? Can we actually have only Arabic and Persian, or are there any other classifications that maybe are not as famous?
Actually, I think that the architecture of the Gulf is very typical, well-rooted in the area, belong to this area, developed in this area. But as Ibrahim said, that still some influences from the surrounding can penetrate into this style. On the eastern shore of the Gulf, for example, you don't see a lot of pointed arches. You don't see a lot of round arches, but you see the corner arches, for example. The corner arches, I think that it is more typical of the eastern sure than the, for example, when you go toward Kuwait, you begin to see Iraqi influence, more Iraqi influence. When you go to Al-Hufuf Al-Ihsa, you begin to see the inland influences from Najd, for example. But it is not the term itself, it will not apply 100% when you say this is a Persian or no.
Go ahead.
All right. If you are asking about the origin of things, you have to go deep in the history. The courtyard is not Islamic, but has been adapted and became an Islamic. It was mostly Assyrian style. And there, the courtyard has no colonnade, no, it's called mashraqa, or like a terrace on the upper floor, or windows, called it corridor from the upstairs with windows. They don't have that one. It was only like a hole, but has been adapted because it's good for privacy. When you talk about the E1, it was used to be used in the Temple of Fire in Persian history. And they use the god of fire or the god of whatever, they put it there. Has been taken and been used because it has really good mixed or marriage with the inner courtyard, because they put it in this house. That's what you mean.
The Arab masonry type would have bearing walls and then the roof without any decorations and with minimal openings on the walls, whilst the Persian style will have these piers and the recessed panels and decorations that we have seen, for example, in the example of the National Museum. So this is the classification that researchers are now adapting.
Okay. Ibrahim would respond to that. Go ahead, sir.
Actually, as much as we were influenced by the trade and so on, the shores of Persia were sort of influenced architecturally by the Arabs. It's not vice versa. But as these Arabs migrated there, they have adopted to some masonry, some techniques, to the wind tower, and brought it back. So it's an interchange. So the Gulf architecture belongs to the Gulf. There isn't such a thing as Iranian Gulf architecture or Qatari Gulf. It's all this unique, beautiful vocabulary has been created within these shores and exchanged. And it depends what materials you had and what prevailing wind you had. There was some adjustment. Otherwise, I wouldn't say this is given to that or this.
There was another question here.
You mentioned that cities are younger than their inhabitants. Can you elaborate further or relate it on how it affects the Gulf architecture or the vernacular architecture we're having right now, since we have been discussing about the identity and the identity of the Gulf architecture, and it's very evident in the presentations that with the transition from the pearl to the oil that gave the region its modern architecture right now.
Okay, I'll give you a very personal, not a very theoretical comment or answer on your question. I studied mostly in Berlin in the 1990s, and after the fall of the wall there was a certain confusion about how to build up Berlin with all the new government buildings and so on. And then some of my professors at that time came up with the slogan of a Berlinish architecture, and they had actually invented an identity that had no bigger roots, but it dominated the whole discussion about architecture. And today, nobody's talking about this anymore because these professors have retired. During my studies, I went to Singapore to study there as an exchange student, and they never looked back. They only looked forward. And I found this very liberating as a European to be in an environment where the actual problems were tackled in a constructive way, and the image machine was not used to overlay architectural solutions. And so I found it an interesting contrast personally to see what happens to an architectural culture and what are the potentials if the reference points are only in the past, or maybe they are in the present. And I see this as an interesting chance for the generation of architects who practice now in this region to have an open discussion about how to solve the actual problems of these cities. Does that answer your question a bit?
Any more questions?
A little bit on this.
Sure.
About 2000, year 2000, 2002, around this years, in Doha, we had these towers were booming like mushroom in the West Bay. And actually, it was frightening that we were losing our local architecture, and at the same time, the internationalism and globalism was invading our town without doing anything. And actually, it was His Highness, the Father, that felt about this danger, and he took the decision of bringing back Souk Waqif to its what is today. And I felt that part of nostalgia that you know, when we see these glass towers, we feel that we are alienated by this modernism. We feel that we would like to see our past because we see in it a little bit of romantic, a little bit of warmth of our purity of our past. So bringing back the Souk Waqif, I think it was insisting no, the local and our local identity should be obvious and should be clear. We will not let this globalism swallow our culture and our identity.
Fatma, you have a final question? Okay. So I'm really sorry because, Fodil is my great friend, so I cannot. Final question.
It's very final and very short.
Bus is already over.
Oh, sorry. You want to delay it for tomorrow? It's fine.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
It's for Nicholas again. It's your presentation, your cover slide is efficiency identity. Very briefly, in 2 short sentences, where was the identity of the Gulf architecture presented in the buildings you showed to us? And what do you refer about efficiency? Was it tested? I would call it energy efficiency, spatial efficiency, function efficiency. How was that evidenced in certain buildings, especially the one in Kuwait, the Wind Tower building, 2017, by AGI? Thank you.
Okay. I think you're touching the right next chapter to research in. I do not have data about the actual measured efficiency of these buildings, but I appreciate the categories that you mentioned. So it's not only energy efficiency, space efficiency, for example, is a very important topic. So I do not have further information. I look at these buildings and I judge them from my, say, experience as a designer. The Qatar Foundation headquarters, I don't think you can open a window there. So you could question efficiency measures, but potentially this kind of architecture is very inspiring what it could be. You could move it further. So it's in a way, a wild guess. But I feel okay with it. I think it's fine to start a discussion. And that's all it was meant to be. And the identity question, just to say that, it's on the same level. It's the first time I've put this together as a thought. And I think the examples we've seen, without repeating the whole story, shows that these buildings are as they are because they are at a certain place and not anywhere else. And that gives it an identity, I think.
All right, with that said, please join me to thank the 4 distinguished speakers. And I will give the floor to James to direct us for tomorrow.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Tomorrow we resume with day 3 of the Architecture Week. So see you there then. The program, if you don't have it, is available over here on your right. Thank you very much and good night.